Um, Welcome to your last week before break. Um, let's use some of the, like under participants, when you click participants, um, let's do some hand raising. I'm curious how many of you feel like you will be able to take somewhat of a break next week or are trying to prioritize taking some break next week. Okay, a handful of you trying. How many of you, good, okay, that's good. About half of you are going to try that. How many of you are using next week to catch up and feel slightly less behind than maybe you feel right now? Okay. A lot of you using it in that way. Good. I always find the fall semester challenging because the break comes so late. So then when I saw for spring semester that they're moving spring break back, I was thinking about ways that I can still sort of incorporate a mini break about halfway through, just because I think we all need it and always feel like about mid-semester like we could use one. So anyway, that's something that I'm thinking about for the spring now that they've moved spring break back a little bit. So I want to give you a little kind of an overview of the plan for the week. So I'm going to do a short lecture today, and then we're going to break up into your project groups and try to just kind of start chipping away at the second part of the assignment. So I'll go through a few things today, and then I'll show you the assignment requirements, and then you'll break up into your groups and start working. And then my hope is to reserve a lot of time on Thursday to do the same thing. So I'll probably do, again, kind of a short lecture, probably even shorter on Thursday. And then you all can get into your project groups and work on this part two. So I'm gonna share my screen of a few, as always, updates, announcements, things before we delve into the material for today. So let me just share my screen real quick. There's some events and things coming up I wanted to mention, so we're going to take just a few minutes here. Can people see my screen? Thank you. Okay, so I've just seen this week in particular, there's always events and things happening. There are a few this week that I'm really excited about, so I just wanted to share a few things with you all. You know, one of the real benefits of this virtual environment is that so many things that were not accessible before are accessible now. So many of you are likely very familiar with Angela Davis. You may be less familiar, though some of you likely also know Adrienne Maree Brown. They are getting together tonight for a conversation around radical feminist futures. So they are two people who have informed a lot of my work and my activism and my understanding of things. And I just wanted to share this with you all. I think it's 6 to 7:30 tonight. So I put the link to register if you have a desire to do that on the slide there. The other thing that's happening on Wednesday, so many of you again are likely very familiar with Layla Saad. She's the author of Me and White Supremacy. So I know some of you are currently working through her book or have already. So she is having a conversation with Melissa Carter through NYU, New York University. That's Wednesday. I intended to have the time on there. It's in the morning. I think it's 8:30 to 9:30 our time. So same thing there, the link to register is there if you want to do that. For Trans Awareness Week, so the panel last week when we did Visible Voices mentioned that Skylar Baylor was coming to, or not coming, virtually coming to speak. And so I included that information. This is also tonight, and it overlaps with Angela Davis and Adrienne Maree Brown. My understanding is that both of these things will be recorded, so you might consider registering for both, and then you can probably get the recording for one of them. One more. So it's Indigenous Heritage Month, many of you know that, through History Colorado, which is one of the museums down in Denver. There's an Indigenous Film and Arts Festival happening tomorrow evening. They'll be watching 3 different films and kind of having some dialogue about them. So same thing, I included the event registration link there if you have an interest in attending any of these. So yeah, today or this week just felt like every day there was something that I wanted to share with you all. So we'll make sure, Estuardo always does such a nice job of getting slides posted pretty immediately, so you can grab the links to register for these things. Okay, other updates, announcements. So the other thing happening this week is Community Circles has organized a social for Thursday evening from 7 to 8. There's no agenda necessarily. It's meant really just to be sort of an open space for you all to connect and chat and catch up a little bit before you head out for fall break. So if you're able, we would love for you to join that. Again, there's no, you don't have to have been necessarily involved in anything up to this point. If you want to just check in and kind of see what things are happening, that could be a good opportunity for you. I realized we've had like guests and things happening ever since we released the midterms. And so I didn't take a moment yet to sort of give you an update on kind of what the statistics were for the midterm. I like to provide this, of course, you kind of have an idea of how things panned out. So the average you can see there was about a 90. The rate, and these are in percentages, the range was between a 76 and almost 99, and then the median was a 92. So I'm always happy to chat with you if you have questions about the midterm grading, things like that. Between Estuardo and I, we can definitely chat through any of those details. Okay, so then an update on your program planning assignments. So part 2 was, so theme of the semester, like moving back due dates. Part 2 was initially due, I think, the 29th, which is over fall break, and that's not going to be conducive to allowing you all to take some time to rest. So we're going to push that back to Friday, December 4th, with the intention that you all can take a little bit of time to rest over that break. Hopefully between this week, you know, and getting started on it, and then the week when we get back, hopefully, you know, you may be able to take a pause for the break week. And then the third part of it, which is the evaluation piece, was currently slated to be due on Sunday, December 13th. And I had mentioned I had gotten some really important feedback about the challenge of having assignments due on Sunday, when particularly for folks who are caregivers or parents. And so that one I'm going to try to keep due about the same time, but move it to Monday. And really what's left, I just wanted to kind of talk through where we're at with things. So you have parts 2 and 3 that are due, and then really the last piece is some of the participation. So many of you have already attended a community event and submitted your reflection. If you haven't, there's still plenty of time to do that. And then the last piece of participation will be sort of a peer evaluation within your project groups. And that's essentially all that's left. So the program planning, the second part is the largest part. So it's 50 points. Parts 1 and 3 are 25 points. So this is kind of the bulk of it. And then I try to be intentional about sort of paring things down at the very end of the semester. So your evaluation assignment is fewer points than the previous. Okay, I think that was all of my updates and announcements. I'll pause really quickly to see if anybody has questions before we delve into some of the material for today. Okay, and like I mentioned, we will go over the program planning assignment today. So you might have questions after that, which I can certainly answer. So we're going to talk about two topics today in class. One of them is examining this notion of theory within program planning, and the other is looking at logic models. So we're going to start with this notion of theory, and I'm going to sort of introduce this idea of theory in program planning today. I know we kind of introduced this notion of theory broadly last week, or I suppose now it's been the week before. Today we're going to talk about what does it look like to try and incorporate theory into program planning. And this is based really off of Goodson's chapter that you read. But she talks about this idea of a real world approach. So in that chapter, she really describes some ideal approaches, one of which is something called intervention mapping. That is a methodology that if you had taken my health promotion programming course prior to last year when I was out on maternity leave, that's the methodology that we learned in that class. It's a very systematic, detailed, step-by-step approach to program planning. It's not, while there are really important tenets in there, it's not likely that you would find yourself in a situation where you have the capacity, the resources to really robustly go through every step in that process. So what do you do when you're trying to plan a program? You want to incorporate some theory because, as we talked about last week, theory is, you know, this sort of set of existing relationships that predict or explain behavior. And oftentimes things are more likely to be successful if there is some underlying theory. So how do you incorporate that while also acknowledging that oftentimes you don't have all the time in the world to do a really robust program planning approach? So Patricia Goodson talks a lot about this real world approach, and she talks about this notion of trying to develop the implicit story or the story that underlies the relationships that you see. So I'll start by saying your pre-seed model that you created is really integral as we think about moving from this community assessment into proposing a type of program initiative, something that might fill a gap that we identify. So to do that, oftentimes the first thing that you'll do is brainstorm what some of the underlying story is, or the logic behind the existing relationships that you identified in your pre-seed model. Then you start this notion of brainstorming. So you start thinking about what kinds of components might be effective. You might look at what kinds of programs have been created before, or what kinds of things have been done with similar populations. So there's kind of two different routes that you can go. You know, if, for example, there's not a lot of information on the specific population that you have identified, you can look at what other kinds of programs have been created, and then again, what would you need in order to adapt that for the population that you have been looking into. And then after you've kind of, you know, looked in the literature, looked at what kinds of things have been done, then you kind of return to this story and think about how to flesh it out into something that makes sense, where there are relationships between where you are and where you're ultimately trying to get. So we're gonna kind of talk through an example of this, similar to the example that she describes in the chapter. And so she talks about this vaccination example, right? And she says, let's say that our goal is to increase vaccination rates among older, low-income adults. So what you might think about then is, and let's say you're in an organization and your boss has said, we need to create a media campaign. So that's really the extent to which you are going to work from. You know that your ultimate goal is increasing flu vaccination rates, and you know that part of what you need to do is to create a communication campaign. So what you start doing then is you have this story that you're starting to tell. How do we create a media campaign that ultimately leads to increase flu vaccination rates. So you start thinking about, okay, what kinds of messages would be successful? One of the things you might think about then is this notion of communicating to older adults that they are susceptible to getting the flu, right? So people have to feel like there's a threat in order for them to seek out a flu vaccination. So this notion of susceptibility then enters into the model, right? So now you have this media campaign where you're going to raise people's awareness around their susceptibility to the flu to ultimately increase flu vaccination rates. But then you start to think to yourself, okay, but if we just communicate susceptibility and we were to stop there, what might happen? So one of the things that could happen is you could incite fear, right? Where folks might start to become fearful about their susceptibility to the flu. So then you can think about, okay, well, what else would we have to include in this message such that people recognize that they're susceptible, but also feel like they are able to access the thing that we need them to do, which is getting the flu vaccination. So then maybe you add a piece around sense of control or self-efficacy, right? Such that if we can increase folks' perceived sense of control or their ability to actually do the behavior, then again, we will be more likely to be successful. So you can kind of see how you start to create this story, right? What else, I'll just kind of pause for a second. What else could you envision might be important to add to flesh this example out further to ultimately lead to increasing flu vaccination rates?
Oh my God, I'm sorry. I thought I was muted.
You're fine. No problem. Okay, so we have some things coming up in the chat. Thanks. Maybe including a timeline. Okay. Cassie says removing economic barriers. Yep. Maddie says ensuring access. Yes. Okay. So now you're identifying this notion of barriers, right? And we're kind of now taking it to the environment, right? Before, this model was a little bit more centered around the individual, but of course, like we have talked about to no end in this class, the environment is much more likely to impact a person's ability to seek specific behaviors, right? So you might think about how do we identifying what are the barriers, how do we address those barriers? And within that, you might think about what resources would we need to address these barriers, right? Claire mentioned family level involvement, right? So thinking about levels of the social ecological model. We're not only thinking about sort of organizational or community areas, thinking about interpersonal stuff. Andrea brings up a good point about community trust, right? So now you're starting to really identify the layers that are adding to this implicit story. So having this sort of implicit or espoused theory or story starting to be told then can allow you to guide your efforts in thinking about what would I create or what would we brainstorm or create that might address some of these barriers. And some of the things that you all have identified are likely the things that came out in your pre-seed model, right? There may have been under predisposing this notion about sort of education on how to get the flu vaccine, or in terms of reinforcing factors, there may have been this notion of accessibility of resources. There may be an enabling factor around community trust and whatnot. So you can refer back to your pre-seed model to see we have identified some of these challenges already that are part of this underlying story. So when you have then sort of developed this underlying story, then you can look at, okay, what is currently being done? And again, referring back to pre-seed and your community assessment assignment, right? Because part of what you did was identified assets. And within those assets, there's likely a lot of what's currently being done. From there, you can also then identify what are some of the gaps And at that point is when you can think about incorporating some theoretical methods or aspects of theories to support or fill those gaps. So maybe there is a real lack of coordination. Maybe there are a lot of resources available to older adults for supporting them in getting the flu vaccine, but maybe they're really decentralized and unclear and not connected in any way. That's a prime example of a gap that you could then think about, how could we fill that with something? Rather than recreating the wheel or trying to create something new that likely already exists, how are you leveraging what's currently being done in the community and potentially filling a gap or providing an additional support that would allow that sort of, you know, stages to happen so that you ultimately achieve that end goal. So part of what we will do on Thursday, part of what you're going to read for Thursday is a chapter from a textbook. It's actually from the textbook that goes into this intervention mapping approach that Goodson mentioned, that I mentioned. There's an entire chapter that does an overview of all kinds of community level theories. So there are theories around coalition building, there are theories around social action, there are theories related to stigma and discrimination. So what you will do for Thursday is kind of skim through that chapter with a lens of what kinds of theories in here might be relevant for the kinds of things that we're thinking about creating for our program plan. So, so that's what Thursday will be. So you have this notion. Today, I'm hoping part of what you might do is start to brainstorm this underlying story, start to identify some potential gaps, so that as you're reading for Thursday, you can be thinking about, as you're reading these theories, which theories might make sense to incorporate into what you would propose. Questions so far before we keep going? I'll pause for a second. Okay, so let's keep going, and then you know, at any point we can pause and if you have questions that arise. So as you are thinking through this underlying story and a gap starts to emerge and you start to identify something that you could create to sort of fill that gap, you then want to think about, how do I organize, how do we create a structure in which to identify this plan and communicate this plan or this thing that we might create. And so I'm going to introduce or reintroduce this notion of logic models. So you might remember back when Carmen came, I believe that was in September, she talked about, and the topic she was presenting on was food justice. She talked a little bit about and introduced this notion of a logic model. So we're going to circle back to this. And now we will think about it in the context of the kinds of things that you all will be creating. So I have pulled a definition of logic models from the community toolbox. Ultimately, a logic model is meant to be sort of a visual representation of how your effort, your initiative, your program is supposed to work. So within that, you're sort of explaining why your strategy is a good solution. And you're intending to be really explicit and linking, here's the activities that we're proposing to do, and here's how it impacts our outcomes, right? Here's how it's going to lead to the change that we would expect to see. One of the ways that logic models are effective is when they can keep everyone on the same page and moving in the right direction. It might provide a common language for what you're creating so that stakeholders are able to also see the kind of thing that's being created and again, the logic behind, right? That's why it's a logic model. What's the logic behind what we're proposing and why and how it's going to have the outcomes that we're proposing that it will have. So I'm going to revisit the slides that Carmen introduced a couple months ago. So this idea of a logic model, right? Again, it's a visual description of your theory of change, or how you're proposing that you create something and it will change the outcome. And what you're intending to do with it is identify what are the connections between the resources that you have, or the resources you would need, what you would do with those resources, which are the activities, and then what results you would hope to achieve by having those resources to do the activity. Ultimately, that leads to what the result or the outcome is that you are intending to see. So in thinking about reasons to use a logic model, some of these things we've talked about, right? That it intends to be a really clear description of what you're intending to do and why. It's a way to communicate to stakeholders. It's a way to identify gaps in the work, a way to prioritize. If you have lots of different things that you're thinking about, again, creating the logic behind it might allow you to see, okay, this is the piece that's going to be most impactful. And then allows you to really identify what's most important to measure. So part of the benefits of a logic model are when it comes to evaluation, you can tie your evaluation metrics to exactly what you outline in your logic model. So the other piece of what I'm hoping that we can do in your small groups today is start to build out a logic model for your initiative. And so I want to provide just sort of a template. So this is what a basic logic model looks like. You have on the left-hand side what the work is, and on the right-hand side are what the outcomes are intended to be. The other two pieces that are important in logic models are assumptions. So thinking about what assumptions are you making as you identify resources, activities, and outputs, as well as external factors. So what is going on in the community, society, policy, national policies that might be impacting the potential of success? It might be increasing the likelihood of success, or it might be making it harder. But having an acknowledgement and awareness of those external factors is a really important piece of creating this logic model. So resources, right? Those are the inputs. So it's time, it's money, it's talent, right? Human resources, it's equipment, all of the things that go into what you're planning to do. What you're planning to do then are the activities, right? So what are the aspects of the program or initiative that you're creating? Right? Is it an education program? Is it a peer support network? Is it a coalition, right? What are the activities that you're proposing? And then what are the outputs? So who are you intending to reach? How much are you intending to reach them? So if it's peer mentoring, right? How many meetings, how many folks are you going to engage in the process? Those are some of the outputs. And then this piece on the left, the work, leads to the outcomes. And most logic models have it broken up into short, medium, and long term. Short term are often things like awareness, right? You can see them there, knowledge, attitudes, right? If you assess, this is where evaluation starts to become really important, because when you identify things in the outcomes, you're thinking about, are these things measurable, right? Can we measure folks' awareness or their knowledge or attitudes about things? Those are oftentimes the shortest term outcomes that you would see. Ultimately, ideally, those short-term outcomes lead to medium and longer term outcomes. Medium-term outcomes are oftentimes behavior. So if I change someone's awareness or knowledge, does that ultimately impact behavior? And then do those medium-term outcomes ultimately impact the longer term. And you can kind of in some ways think about mapping this onto your pre-seed model, right? Because in your pre-seed you had behaviors, you had health outcomes, you had quality of life, and in some ways that kind of aligns with the short, medium, and long-term outcomes.
Hi, Dr. Chard.
Yeah.
We had a question from Stacy.
Sure, go ahead. Is it in the, I can't, oh.
I was just wondering, with the outcomes part, is there a place, or is this where you might kind of review some unintended outcomes, so that you can kind of have a place to keep a check of those, like if they're negative unintended outcomes, or maybe positive, just so you're aware, you have something to like say, oh, is this happening? Is this something that I need to watch?
Yeah, that's a great point, Stacy. Some people will incorporate those into external factors if there are things outside of it that are going to likely impact the ability to be successful. But I could envision a situation in which something wouldn't necessarily tie to an external factor that could be an unintended consequence. So I think that that's a really good point, that in some way in your model, it would make sense to list, here are the things that we're thinking about that may be unintended consequences.
Mm-hmm.
I had a quick question, a little bit more specifically about the assignment. So when we're thinking about external factors, are we looking at, we're creating a program within the times of COVID-19, or are we looking at creating a program that should maybe before or post COVID-19? I'm just trying to think about, when we think about what resources are available to us, how are we going to reach the population and all of those different other factors. I mean, COVID-19 has affected that so much right now. And so I'd like us to focus on that, like let's create a program in the now, or would you like us to think about, let's create a program for the past or for post-COVID?
Yeah, great question, Javier. I think the reality is that COVID is likely to be here for the foreseeable future, right? And so I would like to see, I think it would be important that we do have some acknowledgement of, here's what this might look like, taking COVID into account. And you could think about, like, is this something that would persist beyond COVID? But I think it would be smart of us to create these with COVID in mind. So yes, good question. Thanks for asking that. So the example here is Hunger Free Colorado. So you can see the mission, right? That Hunger Free Colorado connects people to food resources to meet existing needs and drives policy, systems, and social change to end hunger. And you can see their vision. Every Coloradan has equitable access to the nutritious food needed to thrive and reach their full potential. So I'm gonna go through and show you what a logic model for Hunger Free Colorado might look like. And then we will pause there. I'll do an overview of the assignment, and then we'll break out into your groups. Okay, so I won't read through all of these, but you have it so that you can kind of go back and review. But this notion of Hunger Free Colorado, so you can see, and you can kind of read this either direction, right? Their longest term outcome is that Coloradans afford nutritious foods. So their medium term outcomes are that eligible Coloradans receive their maximum SNAP benefit, and that eligible SNAP beneficiaries retain their benefits as long as they need them. And similar to your pre-seed model, you can see again how each column should lead to the next, right? If these things are happening in this medium term, is this leading to Coloradans affording nutritious foods? In this short term, the learning, we're looking at community members being aware of food resources available to them. So again, that's an awareness piece. And you can see based on how they're phrased, what they're getting at, right? Community members know, so this is a knowledge piece. Community members have empathetic and efficient system navigation. So again, how are these short term leading to the medium term, leading to the longest term? And then on the sort of what the program is side of thing, you can see some of the resources are staff support, right? A full-time employee, a coordinator, the funding they have available. Some of these other, so 5 9 to 5, that's a community organizing, a grassroots organization in Denver. Some of these, right, laptops, some of these are just literal equipment and things that might be needed. Some of the activities that are part of this Hunger Free Colorado hotline. So it's answering calls, responding to referrals, helping people navigate the food systems, and supporting people in actually signing up for SNAP benefits. And then the outputs are, again, you can see these are things that would be easily measurable, right? The number of calls, the number of referrals, the number of folks signing up for SNAP, the number of SNAP applications. So you can see these are the things that should result from the activities that are being proposed. So I have a template for you all that we have in sort of a Google form that you can kind of refer to as you're thinking about building out your story and your logic model. So I want to walk through the expectations for the second assignment, and then we'll jump into groups. Any questions before we delve into the assignment details?
I just want to note really quickly that I also created a Word version of the logic model for you guys to download if it's easier to edit. Just wanted to let you know. I'll include that in the chat as well.
Thank you very much, Estuardo. Have I mentioned before just how much I appreciate Estuardo and everything that he's doing this semester? Yes, so any questions before we delve into that? Thanks again, Estuardo, for doing that.
Laura had one in the chat that I also second.
Should we pretend that we have funding as a resource? That's a good question. I think I would say yes. I think you can, what I would say more is like, what kinds of resources would you need, and include that in, in the input. Think of it more as like, here's what we would need in order to successfully implement this. Thanks for pointing that out, Claire. Okay, so let's talk through the assignment, and similar to last time, I just pulled the details of the assignment and we'll walk through them. So the second part is reviewing existing efforts and then proposing a novel solution. So I realize this is really long, and this is just like the introduction to it. So, but I wanted to do some framing, right? So you've now done this assessment of the community, right? And so the next piece of the process is to review what existing efforts there are, and then propose ways to apply theory to a novel program, initiative, support of some sort. So what you're going to be doing is, when you're proposing this new initiative, you're going to think about what could you create that would support these existing efforts. And a lot of that sort of review of existing efforts will likely tie again to that community assessment and the asset assessment that you've already done. And one note that I just want to make is, as you're creating your proposed solution, while it certainly can address the individual level of the social ecological model, I also want it to address another level. So you can't just create sort of an individual behavior change something. It has to tie to a larger level of the social ecological model. So let's walk through the specific requirements. So the first one is reviewing existing efforts. So I want you to find 2 or 3 existing things that are being done again, either specific to the population that you're working alongside or specific to the health issue that was identified, right? If you've identified something and there isn't anything in this specific community happening, then I'd like you to review what's happening in other communities with similar populations. And you're going to talk about what are these initiatives, how they've been applied, if there's any theoretical basis, and then any other information that might inform how you could leverage this existing initiative. Okay, so the first piece is this review of existing efforts. The second piece, and you can see the points breakdown, the existing efforts is 12 points. This is the largest part of part 2. So this is where you're creating a novel proposal, right? So based on reviewing these existing efforts, looking at the community assets, looking at your pre-seed model, what could be created, leveraged, expanded upon to move toward a comprehensive solution to the health issues that you've identified. And so I have listed some of the considerations that you would want to discuss in this piece. So part of it is which theories or aspects of theories would you propose to incorporate? So again, that's for Thursday, that's really the piece that we're going to touch on. What levels of the social ecological model are being addressed? How have you applied awareness of cultural values and practices to the design? Part of this piece relates to what the Public Health Insight podcast folks presented last week. So this health equity impact assessment tool can help you answer this question of how has health equity been considered? And I link to that tool there. And then how did research or evidence inform this proposal, right? What evidence exists to support the use of this approach with your population? And again, that could be research to show that it has been successful in a similar population. And then back to this point C, how are you applying awareness of any cultural values or differences compared to what you found if you were identifying an initiative in a different population? What are you doing to adapt it to make it relevant for the population that you are working with? Okay, then the actual logic model. So you're going to create this basic logic model around this new initiative you're proposing. You are welcome to break out your outcomes into short, medium, and long term. You don't necessarily have to, but it might help you organize it. But I want to see some level of outcomes. And then outputs, activities, inputs. So the 3 columns on the left-hand side, and then assumptions and external or contextual factors. So you're going to include that basic logic model. And then the last piece is, again, sort of using the framework that Public Health Insight provided. You'll describe your various stakeholder groups and how they might be involved. This I would envision being more of like a bulleted list, right? Here's a stakeholder group, here's how they might be involved. You're welcome to actually include the matrix instead, but some way that we can see that you're thinking about the different stakeholder groups. So I'll pause again before we break out into our groups, but that will be the next piece. We're going to spend the last half hour of class in your groups so you can start kind of brainstorming that underlying implicit logic and start actually filling out the logic model. So I'm going to stop there. I'll stop screen sharing and pause for any questions that you all have. Yep, so Javier has a good question. So this notion, so this is something that, I'll just pause and read your question. How can we add the population of interest into the construction of the program? Are we skipping that piece and moving forward as if they did have a part, or are we focused on a bit more reality and this notion that the population doesn't always have say? So part of the community assessment, that initial assignment was to talk about what additional information that you would need. So part of the way that this is being addressed is to refer back to this first part that you talked about of what additional formative research would need to be collected. That's the first piece of it. The next piece would be in how you identify the stakeholder groups. It will be critical that one of your stakeholder groups is folks who are impacted by whatever kinds of things that you will create. But in the second part, let me just go back. Oh, you can't see my slides. In the second part of your description, this sort of novel proposal, that's part of the way that I could see this coming up is when you talk about how are you applying awareness of cultural values and practices to the design of the intervention. That would be an obvious place for you to talk about this, how health equity has been considered. So there are definitely places as you're describing it that I would expect to see how you are incorporating folks into the process. Is that helpful, Javier? Yeah, okay. And I really appreciated when the group was here, while part of what was noted is that you will all find yourself in situations where the population hasn't been really intentionally engaged with, that this is a role and a responsibility that you all have. And you will find yourself in organizations that are not prioritizing that, because that's the reality. And you all can bring this really important perspective to say that we can't create something without really meaningful engagement with the folks who are most directly impacted by whatever it is we're proposing to create. We will talk, I suppose it's after fall break, about community engagement. And we have a guest coming to talk about it. And I think that will also inform the way that you think about how you are creating this and the process that you're going through to actually, create something. But I cannot stress enough the opportunity that you all have when you go out and you start practicing public health. Many of you already are, right? In your practicum, I can think of examples of students in here right now who have brought this conversation to the table to say, how is what we're doing right now impacting folks who are not at the table right now? So I just want to stress, while you will find yourself in situations, that is part of your responsibility as a public health practitioner to bring that question and bring those voices to the table in the decision making in every way that you can. And I also can't stress enough how likely it is that you will find yourself in a situation where you think that question has been asked, certainly somebody's thinking about it, and yet they aren't, right? And I'll pause because I know some of you, if some of you want to share your experience of that, where you think, I'm in this organization and I would think someone has asked the health equity question, someone has asked the community engagement question. If anybody wants to share their experience, I'll just pause real quick here.
Do you think that the reason that a lot of these, some of these organizations don't engage is that, are they just ignorant, or they just don't want to know? Or I guess maybe both.
I don't know that it's, I don't know for sure. I think there's a level of, like many things, there's a norm that gets adopted that never gets challenged or questioned or thought about differently. And then you just get trained in this way and it just continues. That's where I see our opportunity to break that cycle. So that's one piece that I would offer, but I'll pause and see if others have thoughts that you want to share. I think a lot, before I pause, I think a lot of this is rooted in this sort of saviorism approach that, we think we know best, we are the trained, quote, experts in whatever it is, so we can come in and create something that surely should work because, research says that it should, right? It's all of those assumptions and sort of saviorism complex, right? That just has been how public health has operated. And I think only more recently, have we really started challenging and pushing back on that.
One thing I've seen in not just public health programs is the need or the feeling that organizations need to satisfy grant requirements, or the need that organizations need to prove that what they're doing is successful. And sometimes I think doing that, like you said, creates a little bit of that, I'm forgetting the word, savior type mentality, where they're like, no, we know this works, and we know that we can get good, strong data if we do it this way, that they do lose sight of like, oh wait, how are we including the community?
Yeah, Javier, it ties right into this notion of evidence-based practices, right? And the ways that this notion of evidence-based can be limiting, it can be harmful, it can be short-sighted, right? Because we haven't thought broadly about when the evidence base was established, on whom was it established, under what conditions, with what say, by who, right? There's so many questions to ask when you talk about something that's evidence-based. I am more comfortable thinking about things as being evidence-informed versus like trying to stick so closely to something that's evidence-based, but it does get to the challenge of funding. And what are the requirements of the funding, right? Do they want to see evidence for program effectiveness? I have an example right now. So I'm working with an organization in town called the BIPOC Alliance, and I am on the White Solidarity team, and I'm on the grant writing team because that's a skill set that I have been able to offer. And so we wrote a grant to an organization for an RFA, a request for applications, that was all about providing funding for organizations that are trying to break down systems and structures that are racist, right? It was really about identifying systemic racism and what kinds of organizations are pushing back against this. So we wrote an application, submitted it, and almost immediately an email came back to say, well, you're so new and you don't have a lot of evidence to show how effective you've been. We don't typically fund organizations at this level. It was a very large grant. They said, we don't typically fund organizations that are this new, that don't have, evidence. And that was an opportunity for us to push back a little bit and demonstrate just how oppressive that is and just how counter that is to what they're proposing that they're funding. And we're literally kind of in the back and forth right now as we speak, kind of waiting to hear what their response will be. So it's just an example of these things are happening right now as funding opportunities are available. But it also gets at what's our opportunity to advocate and point out the ways in which funding organizations and structures are oppressive in nature. Okay, so let's go ahead and break out into your groups. Estuardo, thanks again for fixing. So if you all would re-click, if you already clicked on the Word document, looks like Estuardo made an edit to that. So you might re-click it just so that you have the right one. And then you all I'll hang out in the main room, and you can either pop back to the main room, or there's that option to request help or whatnot